We often think of history as just a timeline of events involving famous people. But often, history is made by people you've never heard of. Tonight on The Best Times, we tell you about the Memphis history you do not know. Funding for The Best Times is provided by the Plow Foundation, striving to do the greatest good by helping the greatest number of people since 1964. Additional funding is provided by the members of WKNO. Thank you. Hello, I'm Chris Hardaway. Welcome to this edition of The Best Times, a series that looks at life after 50. There is nothing new in the world except the history you do not know. That quote is attributed to President Harry Truman. The history we learned in school was mostly about wars and disasters, kings and queens, and presidents and generals. But much of the time, history is made by people you've never heard of. Tonight, in part 2 of our interview, Wayne Dowdy, archivist with the Memphis Public Library, brings us a few stories about Memphis and the history you do not know. Let's talk about Johnny Ashcraft, because it was his legal case that actually went all the way to the Supreme Court.
That's right.
And led to a legal precedent
yes.
out of his case.
Johnny Ashcraft was a dragline operator in Memphis, and one night his wife disappeared, and she was found in a ditch off the Raleigh Road, and she was murdered. She had been murdered. Well, the police department and the sheriff's department both quickly determined that Ashcraft was guilty. So they arrested him, took him to a room in the Shelby County Jail, and began to question him, to interrogate him. And they used coercive methods. What we sometimes see in the movies is the third degree, right?
Yeah.
You know, under a bare bulb and yelling and screaming, well, you know you did this, you know, whatever. And they refused to allow him to sleep or eat for 36 hours. And at the end of that 36 hours, they came to him and said, we've got a confession we want you to sign. And he said, I didn't make this confession. I'm not signing this. They charged him with murder anyway, tried to introduce the confession into the court record. He was found guilty, and the case he appealed.
He was found guilty even though he didn't sign the confession.
That's right. He's found guilty anyway, pretty quickly in 1941. So he's found guilty, he appeals, and it eventually makes its way to the Tennessee Supreme Court, then the U.S. Supreme Court. The case is decided in 1944, and the opinion is written by Justice Hugo Black, who, for those who know about the Supreme Court, was one of the most liberal members of the court, strong believer in civil liberties. And he makes it clear in his decision, which is agreed upon by the rest of the court, although there is a minority, there is an opinion that disagrees with his, but that the police cannot coerce confessions out of people. They cannot keep people for 36 hours without the basic necessities of life and then expect them to be able to tell the truth at the end of that time. And he says very clearly, there are other governments in this world who have police who break down people's doors in the middle of the night, haul them into a police building and find them guilty very quickly and execute them. We don't do that in America. That's against the Constitution. As long as the Constitution governs this land, then that is unconstitutional. And of course, this changes how police deal with suspects across the country. I mean, if many of the people who are watching this probably have watched Law and Order and other police procedurals, you know, and you'll see things. Well, we can only keep we only keep him for 72 hours, or we can't detain him for 36 hours, whatever the number is. And there are other things they can't do because they're illegal. And the Ashcraft case is the foundation of all of those things. So the next time folks watch one of those things and hear something like that, remember that it came out of Memphis. And it was the first U.S. Supreme Court case to come out of Memphis. And so a very important foundation for our civil liberties.
And it leads to other precedents because
Miranda follows
maybe a decade or so
later. And, you know, this question of how far can law enforcement go in the fulfillment of their duty. And there's, of course, differences of opinion on that, but it's the courts ultimately that decide. And the courts have consistently upheld Ashcraft as being, you know, a very important foundation for, you know, keeping track of police procedures.
When you sent me this next story, I was a little surprised because I guess I never connected Memphis with communism.
Right.
But in fact, there were communists in Memphis.
There were. The first communists that we have a record of were in the early 1930s. And let's keep in mind what's going on at this time. This is the Great Depression. Thousands of people out of work, even larger numbers of people who are destitute. And of course, people are looking for any answer in the early 1930s. And communism is one of those answers.
Right, Workers of the World Unite sounds pretty good.
Yeah, it does indeed. When you've been lost your job and can't find another. And so, in 1932, 3 communist agitators come to town, and they hold a meeting in a home on Breedlove, and they advertise it as just, you know, need unemployment assistance? Come to this meeting. So about 25, 26 Memphians go to this meeting, and they're sitting there, and all of a sudden they start talking about communism, and the Memphians are rather bewildered about all this. And all of a sudden the police bust in, and a riot squad comes in, and the 3 communists jump out of the windows and flee. But that's the first indication that we have, or first evidence we have of communist sort of activity in Memphis. That same year, 1932, later that year, there were 2 communists who ran for local office. There was a man named Ollie Overton, no relation to...
Not that Overton.
Not that Overton,
okay.
No. Who ran for Congress against Mr. E.H. Crump. He didn't succeed.
Unsuccessfully.
Yes, unsuccessfully. Yes. And then a man named G.B. Adams, who ran for sheriff, for Shelby County Sheriff. Now, we don't know really anything about Overton, but Adams had been a woodworker, and he had worked in a factory making axe handles. And the Depression devastated that economy, and he was down to working 1 day a week. And so he turned to communism because he felt that capitalism was not doing him any good. And he was unsuccessful as well, but there were small cells of communists who operated through the 30s and 40s, not a lot of activities like we saw in the early 30s, but it sort of reemerges in the 1950s. And in 1954, there was a very important case that took place in Memphis. There was a man named Junius Scales, and Scales was the leader of the regional communist cells in North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. And he visited Memphis often, and one day he is standing out in front of the Methodist Church on Union when a couple of FBI men come and arrest him. They had been tracking him for some time, and it was raining that night, and he was standing there in an umbrella, and all of a sudden 2 men come and pick him up, and Junius Scales becomes a very important case in terms of communism. He reveals a lot of information about how he got involved with communism, how he rose through the ranks to become sort of a regional director of communist organizations. And more importantly, he is charged under a federal law called the Smith Act. And the Smith Act was a law that had been passed several years before 1954 that made it illegal for an American citizen to be a member of an organization that vowed to overthrow the federal government. Now, the Smith Act was never really challenged in court, so but it was always questionable whether it was actually constitutional or not. And Scales is the only person who was ever arrested and charged and convicted of the Smith Act, and he was sent to federal prison, sentenced to like 10 years in prison. And it's interesting because the Scales case becomes sort of a cause célèbre amongst the left wing and liberal and Democratic Party elements in the country who see it as an unjust situation. And one person who was influenced by the Scales case was the Attorney General of the United States, Robert F. Kennedy. And he looked over the case because there were people who were constantly saying, you know, he needs to be let out of jail. This is wrong. He shouldn't be put in jail for his political beliefs. We don't do that in America. And Kennedy investigated the case in the early 1960s, and he convinced his brother, President John Kennedy, in 1962 to commute his sentence, and he was released. So, and after Scales was captured here, the communist movement, which was extremely small in Memphis, collapsed. In 1957, Mississippi Senator James Eastland had a Senate committee investigating subversive groups, and he held a meeting. He held hearings in Memphis in 1957, and the only thing they could uncover were 2 Marxists who had left the party years before. So big splash in the newspapers, no communists in Memphis, you know, and because Scales was an idealistic young man. He didn't understand, I don't think, the role he may have been playing in Soviet plans, and but it's fascinating to think that here in the South, which has been traditionally so anti-communist and understandably so, that we had these cells operating here, and I think most Memphians would be surprised to learn that. But it is fascinating. It shows us the reach of sort of communist organizations and how people turn to it in times of need.
Well, often history is stranger than fiction.
That's right.
When I was growing up, my parents would bring me to the Mid-South Fair every year.
Yeah.
And like clockwork, we would go through the cattle barn, see all of the cattle, all of the animals.
Yes.
You've got an interesting saga about the cattle barn.
Well, the cattle barn, you would think that of all the things that we could talk about, an agricultural building at a fairgrounds
Right.
would not make the list, right?
No, it wouldn't cause an uproar. In
That's
any way,
right. But in reality, it did. In the early 1950s, the cattle barn was being expanded, and they hired an iron company in town to build an addition to it and expand it. And they subcontracted to another iron company, a steel iron company in Dyersburg. The Dyersburg company did not hire union workers. Well, Memphis had a very strong skilled labor movement, not a lot of unskilled labor organized here, but skilled labor, very powerful, politically influential, large numbers of Memphians belonging to these unions, including the Iron Workers Union. So they're rather upset that non-union workers are working on this project, particularly because it's a city project, and the city has long-standing agreements with, they may be unofficial agreements, but nevertheless understandings that the city of Memphis will hire only union workers. So they go out to talk to the non-union workers at the fairgrounds one day, and they bring with them such negotiating tools as bats and other handheld
this doesn't
weapons.
sound like a friendly talk.
No, it's not
It's not a
intended.
chat.
No, it is
No.
not. In fact, the intention is to intimidate them into hiring union workers. Well, the non-union workers pick up pieces of iron. They're iron workers, after all, and they start throwing them at these guys and attacking some of them, and they go away. But the next day, they come back, and this time they're armed with pistols. Well, the non-union workers are also armed with pistols because they'd got roughed up the day before too, and didn't want it to happen again. So as soon as they stepped out of the car, the non-union workers started firing on the union workers.
So there was like a gunfight at the cattle
There was a
barn.
gunfight at the cattle
OK
barn. That's
Corral.
right. That's exactly right. Several men were wounded. Fortunately, nobody was killed. And of course, the police swoop down. They arrest everybody who's standing around. And they go to court, and they are able to identify several of the people whom they believe were involved in the actual violence. They are charged with malicious mischief and mayhem, and found guilty. The city, goes down and tries to negotiate some sort of an agreement. There really isn't an agreement that takes place, but no one is really satisfied. But the cattle barn gets built, or gets renovated, and but then a couple of months later, the following year, right after it's finished in the spring of 1955, and there are a group of girls who are attending Fairview Junior High. And one day they go downtown and watch the movie Blackboard Jungle. And for those who don't know, the Blackboard Jungle is the story of a sort of idealistic teacher that goes into a quote-unquote slum area and is teaching poor kids. And these kids are violent, many of them. Back then they were called juvenile delinquents. And so they see this movie, and they're just enthralled by this culture that is so far removed from what they live. And they want to be cool like the kids in the Blackboard Jungle. So a small group of them form their own gang.
A girl gang.
A girl gang,
Okay.
and they call themselves the Corpus Debs. Which is an unusual name. You would think, the Jets or the
Or something like that. Something with a little.
yeah. But they have a list of bylaws where they say, don't squeal if the cops pick you up, and this sort of thing. And so they decide to be cool, and they set the cattle barn on fire.
After it's just been
built.
Amazing.
And it's pretty much burned to the ground, except of course for the iron that was, right.
Yes,
And so the frame survives. It's just the wood and everything that. The young women are quickly arrested, and they forget about their vow not to squeal and explain to the police what they were doing, and they were put on trial and found guilty of burning, of arson, and sent to the juvenile court and sent to a facility. One thing that I think is very good that should be brought out is the newspaper stories do not mention these young ladies' names, so we don't know who they were, which is a good thing, because they shouldn't have to spend the rest of their lives.
With that black mark
That's
on
right.
them,
Exactly,
yes.
Exactly. They were just dumb kids who made a
Yeah.
mistake, and fortunately, no one was hurt. It would have been different, perhaps, if someone had been hurt, but they quickly rebuilt, and it was open for the 1955 Mid-South Fair in September. And of course, it continued until 2008 when the fair moved.
Yep.
And like you, I went to the cattle barn all the time. And in fact, the cattle barn is where we would have one of the places we'd have our Boy Scout show every year, and we used to do cooking demonstrations in there. So yeah, the fairgrounds was a very important part of the culture of Memphis, and
it survived a Union riot, but couldn't survive the Corpus Dibs.
that's right. That's exactly right.
All right. Let's move on to another story. This one is about a gentleman who is really a significant name in gospel music, not just here in Memphis, but nationwide. Oris Mays.
That's right, Oris Mays. One thing that when we talk about Memphis music, too often we forget that Memphis has also been a strong leader in gospel music as well as other forms of music. There have been significant composers, and one of them was Oris Mays. Oris Mays was the pastor of a local church who loved gospel music. In fact, he really sort of started his career, he wanted to be a gospel singer. He didn't want to be a preacher. In fact, he sort of rejected that part of that life until he would say later that he was called to become a preacher, to do more than simply sing about the gospel, but also to teach it. So he goes to seminary, becomes a preacher, but he's still very involved in music, and he composes several gospel songs. And in 1966, he's given the opportunity to host his own television show on WMC Channel 5. And it would come on Sunday mornings, and it was on for several decades. And it would come on, I remember it as a matter of fact.
I do too.
Because it would come on before Magic Land.
Before Magic Land,
And so
yes.
I would, I was far more interested in Mr. Magic than I
Right,
was Oris
exactly.
Mays. But he introduced so many people to that style of music, and had an impact on a lot of people's lives. He said, towards the end of his life, he said, because of the TV show, which was shown in other parts of the country, it was syndicated, other local television stations would broadcast it as well, mostly in the Midwest, a little bit in the North. And he would get letters from people all over the country saying, I heard you, saw your show, and would tell them about some problem they had, something they were struggling with. And he would always write them back. He would always offer any advice or comfort that he could. And he used that music to make people's lives better. And he said, if you're not helping somebody, you don't have a job. You're not doing anything for this world. And so he saw the show as an extension of his ministry. But it was more than that. It strengthened Memphis's place as a musical center. It obviously inspired hundreds of people to perform that music and buy those records and listen on the radio. And so it's very important, not to mention the lives that were impacted by the music and his show. And yeah.
Well, we always think that Memphis, has such a rock and roll history.
That's right.
But we have an incredibly strong gospel music history.
We do
as well.
indeed. I mean, Mays belongs up there with other gospel composers who perhaps are slightly more well known: Lucy Campbell, Herbert Brewster, Olanda Draper, as well as others. Those are three that I think most people who know anything about or have just been around Memphis for a long time have heard those names. And at one time you heard Oris Mays more than any of the others because of his television show. He's been forgotten a little bit, but not in the hearts of many people who heard that show, watched that show.
And he lives on.
And he does it with the
songs
songs he composed and the recordings that he made.
Well, Wayne, this is fascinating. Thank you for being on the
Thank you
show.
very
I love
much.
to hear about the history that we don't know. It just proves that history is often stranger than fiction.
It is indeed, and history happens to people, and people. There are all kinds of people in this world.
Thank you, Wayne.
Thank you.
Want more information about life after 50? Go online to watch more shows and find more resources. And send us your feedback and story ideas to besttimes@wkno.org. That's all for this edition of The Best Times. Please join us next week for more stories about life after 50. Until then, I'm Chris Hardaway. Thanks for watching. Good night. Funding for The Best Times is provided by the Plow Foundation, striving to do the greatest good by helping the greatest number of people since 1964. Additional funding is provided by the members of WKNO. Thank you.